Thank you. Just before I call Jan Logie, the Speaker's rulings that I was looking for before were 47, 3 and 4. Jan Logie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am very pleased to rise and offer the Green Party's support for the second reading of the Social Security Clothing Allowances for Orphans and Unsupported Children's Amendment Bill. And I commend the member, Tracy Martin, for bringing this to the House and for her excellent advocacy and communication of the issue as we went through the committee process. And I will come back to your submission in the process of my speech. And I would also like to acknowledge and thank the grandparents raising grandchildren for their advocacy on this, and even more I'd like to thank them for their wonderful, precious work that they do that is making such a difference to their grandchildren and to our society as a whole. This bill, fundamentally as it was introduced and as it is now, is about fairness. It's about addressing a very small but important inequity in the funding which goes to support some of the most vulnerable children in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Those who have, through death or family breakdown, lost the support of their parents and are in the care of a family member. While the quantum of the funding discrepancy may appear small to us sitting here in this House of Representatives, it is very significant for many of the carers and children who receive it. It makes a tangible, real difference that is visible in the life of those families. And there has been no logical reason for the inconsistency between funding for foster children and funding for unsupported children and orphans. And it seems to be just one of those many anomalies, actually, that have developed over the years from the highly complex and much amended legislative and regulatory provisions governments have put in place in their attempts to fix a system when issues have come to their attention. And the goal, I suppose, of supporting our most vulnerable children, but which has left so many gaps because it has lost sight of our contemporary world and that vision of what we're hoping to achieve with our legislation. Through the committee process, we heard really moving submissions from a range of kin caregivers and particularly grandparents caring for grandchildren who spoke about their desire to do the best that they could for their grandchildren after so many of them had already been through such terribly traumatic experiences where children, as I think Ms. Martin described in her speech, had experienced things that we would never ever want children to have to experience, or have seen things that children should never ever have to see, and who have ended up many times traumatised and with psychological disorders as a result of those experiences, as well as physical disabilities in some cases. And these children in the care of their grandparents who desperately want to do the best for them were missing out on the same opportunities, the same support from the state that children who went into the care of strangers were getting. And there were examples given to us of family members who were caring, or grandparents I think it was, who were caring for a grandchild but also had a child in foster care. And quite often that generosity of spirit of these grandparents extends to foster children. And this bizarreness of the fact that they were getting money from the state for clothing allowance for that foster child and not for their own kin, and them not actually having the financial resource to be able to provide their grandchild with the same clothing support. Imagine that. that was you, and you had your own grandchild there, and you weren't able, in your own care in the same house, and you weren't able to offer them the same clothing support that you could offer a child who wasn't a family member. That is a very bizarre situation, and one that is rightly being fixed by this bill, and I'm thankful that there seems to be unanimous support in the House for fixing it. Because for them, the clothing allowance is meaningful. And I think I said in my first reading speech that, you know, as a greenie, I'm quite into second-hand clothing. I get the whole kind of concept of making do and reusing and recycling. It's a thing I like. But I get that when you're at high school or at primary school, actually, it's only a certain amount of kids that are into that. And it's really important to fit in when you're at school and you've been through hard times. And to be in a position where you don't have a choice, or your family doesn't have a choice for you to have new clothes, that's unfair. And we don't want that for our most vulnerable children. And it's good to be fixing that. So this allowance is meaningful, but it's also symbolic. And it's really important that those children and their caregivers know that this house, that this society supports them and wants as much for them as for every other child in this society. I would note that, and I do want to come back to and mention Tracy Martin's submission to the Select Committee, because it was a thing of beauty, I've got to say. And I seem to be commending other members in the House tonight, and I'm just going to go with that goodwill. But it really was. She came to the committee with two cutouts, one of Henry and one of Audrey, and demonstrated to the committee what this bill was about by using kind of post-it notes. So we had Henry, who was in the care of foster parents, and Audrey, who was in the care of a caregiver. And they were both entitled to the same amount of a basic allowance, those families, and their kids themselves. But then Henry, who was in the care of foster parents, was also entitled to pocket money of $6.30 a week. He was a 6-year-old, which was $327.60 a year. And then Audrey, who was in the care of a caregiver, was not. Two children, same needs, same likely background, one entitled to $327.60 a year, the other not. And then again, Henry was entitled to an allowance for annual birthdays and Christmas allowances of $82.60. Audrey, caregivers, nothing. And it was really a tangible kind of feeling in response to it. And then we got to the clothing allowance, where Henry was entitled to $1,129.64 at that time a year. And then Audrey, who was in the care of family, nothing. And they could be in the same household. They could be being cared for by the same people with a really fixed income and an inability to match that $1,129.64. Unjust. And I thank you for making it so clear for the committee. And you have done negotiations and you have done accommodations in getting us to this point, because what this bill does is not introduce absolute parity yet. It's recognising that the government has, through some initiatives, has put in up to $550 a year for school and startup fees by 2015, alongside a one-off establishment grant of $350, and that comes to about, what is that, $900 a year. It doesn't actually reach full parity, so we're still not going to get there, but you've made that allowance because that is a whole lot better than nothing, and this bill will ensure that while that money is there until 2018 and guaranteed, this bill will ensure that money is available after that guaranteed funding stops. So it's a really, really important initiative, but it does, I've got to say, still seem a little bit mean-spirited of the government not to be able to just simplify the system, make sure nobody misses out, and just create the parity. It doesn't seem too much to me to ask, particularly when really we acknowledge this is a band-aid on the sore of poverty that is killing our children.